Well, it's time for some combat radio, and the movie is Jaws. Well, a great white shark terrorizes the New England fishing town in the Steven Spielberg classic Jaws, written by Peter Benchley, the book by Peter Benchley, who was a journalist for the Washington Post for a time. Maybe the scariest movie of all time, certainly one of the best. And to break it down with me now is everyone's favorite showrunner, actor, director, producer, all-around intrepid talent, Mr. Jude Prest. Jude, how are you?
I'm great, man. How you doing?
Good. You picked this one. It's an easy pick because it's an epic movie, but Jaws, obviously one of your favorites.
It is. You know, when we've done these, I've kind of focused on ones that I loved for one reason or another. But Jaws, I think, is a movie that no matter how many times you watch it, no matter how many times it comes on TV, no matter how many times you talk about it, it's a movie that holds up in every way, I think.
Well, Spielberg always has been a master at blocking a scene. He definitely proved it in Jaws. He proved it the first time out in Duel, which in some ways seemed like a blueprint for this. But, you know, to start with, the movie had the production stories are infamous. We've had screenwriter Carl Gottlieb, who incidentally wrote a great book on this project called The Jaws Log. He's been on this show a number of times, along with Oscar-nominated production designer Joe Alves, and the conversation always comes back around to Jaws. The stories are always about Jaws. My old boss at Warner Brothers, John Milius, had a hand in this. We'll get to that in a bit. But out of the gate, David Zanuck, after being fired by his dad after running 20th Century Fox, managed to get the rights to this. The book is fantastic, although very different from the movie itself. And the casting, well, to start with, before we get into the casting, have you read the book for this, Jude?
I have. I read the book back right when there was buzz about the movie back in the 70s. I had read the book, and, you know, the book is very different. And they changed, and I think probably rightly so, a lot of things. And Benchley wrote like 3 passes of the script and finally got to the point where he just said, I've done everything I can do with it. And that's when they brought in Carl and,
Right.
people like that. And Spielberg wanted a little bit more of a comic thing. You know, they're in the book, Hooper and Brody's wife have an affair, and Spielberg felt that would kill the relationship with them on the boat ultimately and everything. So he changed a lot of stuff, and I think it was ultimately for the better.
Well, Benchley did take a couple passes at the script. And look, it's a world full of Jaws elitists. What we're going to do here is discuss what we know from firsthand production scenarios as far as how this thing came together. And Benchley did write the script. Then Sackler, who wrote The Great White Hope with James Earl Jones, took a crack at it. And the story that I got was that he actually broke the back of it for Spielberg, or at least to the point where Spielberg could commit initially to doing the film before he tried to decommit, right?
Right.
Sackler took a crack at it. Gottlieb's the one who's kind of the unheralded hero in the screenwriting process, you know, who also plays Meadows in the film.
Yeah, very funny. And I think he gave him his pick of whatever he wanted to do, and he went through the script and picked that. I have one from some of our events. I have your events. I have one of those production design posters from Alves, and it is one of my favorite pieces. Just the production design on that, the drawings, the artwork, the ultimate shark. I mean, I'm not the first person to say this, obviously, but the best thing that ever happened was that shark didn't work.
Right.
Because it made it much more Hitchcockian and much less B-movie horror, as Spielberg himself said.
I think the strategy with Spielberg, developed with Bill Butler, the DP, to build a box, drop the camera in it, and photograph everything at like water level, really started to tap the psychology of the audience. But moving past that, if you say the shark didn't work to Joe Alves, he'll argue with you. He says, and he stands by it, you can hear everything we say regarding Alves and Gottlieb is backed up in a combat radio archive someplace.
Yes.
But if you say the shark does not work, Alves gets pissed. He goes, the shark worked just enough, and the shark working around the shark is obviously what gave the film a major part of its magic. But before we get to the shark and the 3 or 4 different sharks that doubled as the one shark Bruce, named after Spielberg's lawyer Berman, the casting on this movie is pretty notorious. Initially, Lee Marvin for Quint didn't want to cut short his vacation. He was out fishing off the coast of Mexico. Then Sterling Hayden
To play Quint.
Well, actually, I heard Heston for Brody, And Spielberg said, that's like having a V12 when I need a V8. Heston is like so big in terms of screen persona that the shark wouldn't have a chance, right? But I think also that's very smart, because at the moment Heston is cast, I don't think anyone thinks Heston is being killed off in this movie. And with Brody, you're never sure.
I'm not sure the Ascot would have worked either, but
Speaking of. But, you know, and then Jan Michael Vincent is Hooper. And the first major change from the book that I heard was the three characters, the three principals, were very unlikable and had to be re-engineered so the audience would sympathize with them and root for them. And props to Zanuck, who got his deal at Universal after being fired for running Fox and saying, look, A to Z adventure story, cut the love triangle out, cut any of those dramatic elements. This is a terrorist in the water. We're going to battle a terrorist right through to the end. We're not going to get caught up in any of these B or C storylines. And that sort of script efficiency, I think, really got him out of the gate and helped a lot. Now, of course, the production timetable, which was originally set for like 40 or 50 days, tripled.
54 days, I think. Actually, 55 days, and it went to 195.
Ugh. And the saving grace was, in fact, Gottlieb, who I think, because there was a looming strike, got hired on the picture as an actor. And he always kind of bemoans the fact that he had to write himself out of the script. In fact, he told us on Combat Radio that there was a death scene where they shot it, where he falls off the boat and the shark basically gets him in that big scene where they all go out of the harbor and they're chumming the entire Atlantic Ocean for this bastard. And can't seem, they get the wrong tiger shark or whatever it is. And then Gottlieb in that scene, I guess, dies, or that's how they shot it. But I don't know where that scene is. If it's on a Blu-ray somewhere or what.
Yeah, I love the little details in it. I mean, I love the making of, you know, you talk about the shark and that infamous story, but I love the fact that, like, Spielberg felt he needed one more scare, and that was the head popping out of the boat, Ben Gardner. And they wouldn't put up any money for a reshoot. So he actually did that in the editor's swimming pool in Encino, paid $3,000 of his own money. And I just love those stories of the making of this and how kind of everything from the weather to the mechanics to the delays to, you know, even Robert Shaw with what I personally feel is probably one of the best monologues ever put on film is the USS Indianapolis speech. You know, that he came in stinking drunk for that, and then, you know, came in the next day apologetic and like nailed it.
Well, I've got a lot of information on that speech that we'll get to in a minute. The story with Shaw that I heard is that he was having martinis that by the time he was in the makeup chair in the morning. That he was a notorious drunk. He was my favorite actor as a kid, not because of Jaws, I was too young to see it, but because he was in Swashbuckler with James Earl Jones, the pirate.
I love Swashbuckler.
So did I as a kid. Now, it doesn't hold up, but that's the reason I loved Robert Shaw, right? So, you know, Shaw's working habits and social habits blended together in notorious fashion. The Verna Fields Verna Fields cut the film from basically her pool house. They shot that in her pool. Dan Truly, incidentally, a regular on this show, producer of Law and Order SVU and Blue Bloods, just managed to find the owner of Verna Fields' old house out in the front yard and begged to take a picture poolside, and the owner let him do it. So Dan Truly is just like posting a photo of him in the pool like he's just won the Olympics. I mean, you could just total Dan Truly magic, Jaws magic, worlds coming together. But it is true. In fact, Alves told me we had wrapped on Jaws, and then Zanuck was told, we've got dailies. And Zanuck says, what are you talking about? The movie's done. And he was told, basically, without being informed initially, again, I'm quoting Joe Alves, and the Combat Radio archives will back all this up. These are his stories. He said, no, Steven went off and shot something in Verna's pool. And he's like, all right, well, let's see what it is. And I should also say, in a tributary sense, our studio is based in the Verna Fields building on the Universal backlot. So we have a certain connection with Verna now. So they shoot that scene. They put milk in the water to make it look like the murky Atlantic. Obviously, it's the most memorable moment in the movie for some of us. And it's just an absolute classic moment. Alves told me that the scene where the shark's banging at the hull and the water's coming in is actually him kicking in Verna's driveway, kicking the paneling they had mocked up and spraying it with her garden hose.
That's awesome.
So it was one of those classic little production stories from Oscar nominee Joe Alves.
You've got those fantastic stories. I mean, I've met all of them, through the events, but man, I'd love to sit down and hear a bunch of those stories.
Well, leave it to combat radio to beat stories out of people incessantly, and those guys have always been great about it. Now, moving forward through the movie, right? Obviously, great, stunning beginning, one of the best in movie history, I think. From there, all these characters to me are very believable, including the casting of Lorraine Gary, who was married to Universal President Sid Sheinberg at the time. And some people have implicated that she was signed on for insurance purposes, and if that was the case, that's a very smart hire, because she definitely kept, I think, that movie going when they probably thought to pull the plug. I think Sid said, well, give him another week, give him another week, give him another week. My wife's on this movie. And he also believed in Steven Spielberg, of course. But she's actually quite convincing. I think it's a good hire.
She kept it going for 4 sequels too, I think, or 3 sequels as well. I mean, she was the only one, I think, that was in all the sequels.
Now, is she in the third one? I know Joe Alves directed Jaws 3D. Is she in that? Does she make an appearance in that?
You know what? I'm not sure. I know I thought I read that she was in all 4 of them. But yeah, I really like, and they didn't agree with it, that he hired so many local people and unknowns, which, he wanted unknowns. The studio wanted more names. One of the interesting casting things for me that I would have been very curious to see how it was Robert Duvall was being considered for Brody. But he wanted Quint, from what I understand. And he didn't get that. But yeah, she did a great job in that. The woman who plays the mother was a local that slaps Brody. And she didn't want to do it. I just was reading up on this last night. She didn't want to do it because they had a lot of cursing in it, and she refused to curse.
Well, Mark Marshall, our editor here of Harry Potter fame, was Steven Spielberg's assistant for a long time, and he told me that actress actually walked into some New England diner that turned out to be owned by the actor who played her son, who gets chopped up. And they met. I think there was a menu item on the menu that's somehow related to Jaws, like the Kittner special or something like that. And they met for had a reunion right there in the diner and kind of lived it. She's since passed away, but she's brilliant in the movie, and she told stories that for decades people had been asking her, hey, slap me, slap me, slap me. She was famous for slapping people. And, just what everyone in the movie to me is absolutely solid. There's not a weak performance in this movie. In fact, extras or atmosphere, which is constantly disrespected in our business, they are absolutely believable. Like when they're storming out of the water, they look terrified. When they're standing on the beach in shock, they look like they're in shock. And all these players that had a day here and a day there are fantastic. Have you seen the outtakes to this movie?
I've seen several. I've seen the the documentaries, and I've seen as many outtakes as I have for the thing I'd like to get. I don't have it yet. I'd like to get the 4K, the 45th anniversary restoration. I guess there's more on that as well.
There's a scene in it where Quint goes into a music shop and buys piano wire, which is actually what he uses when he's fishing for Jaws. Piano wire. And I don't know if, obviously, Spielberg didn't think it was necessary because it was cut. It is interesting. I mean, you could have just as easily showed him opening a pack of piano wire, probably.
Yeah.
But this movie, those three, and the stories between them obviously are very notorious. But man, those 3 actors absolutely sell it. And Dreyfuss talks quite openly about not wanting to do the movie, about thinking that the movie previous that he did, The Apprentice of Duddy Kravitz, or Apprenticeship of Duddy, gonna be a disaster. Get me on Jaws. Hire me, baby. Frantic to get back on it. And then he does the kind of thing that makes every executive director and producer go absolutely nuts. He doesn't have any faith in it, and then he gets out in front of it before it's released and starts shit-talking it. Yeah. He since confessed it wasn't one of his best moments, but it's really rare that he must have felt very desperate at the time to go on like major news outlets and say with confidence, this movie's not going to be any good, and it's Universal's fault. Like, yeah. I don't know. Can you imagine the diplomatic patchwork that had to be done after those interviews?
Yeah, I don't understand any actor going out ahead of anything, because you just never know. I mean, this was obviously lightning in a bottle, but I think if you and there were so many problems, but I just don't understand anybody ever going out and say, dumping on something before it's gotten out there, because that can only come back bad on you,
Yeah, like why do you want to train wreck your project? I mean, at least see a rough cut. Or maybe he had seen a rough cut at that point, but it was definitely not the thing to do. He's quite open about that now. I mean, everyone going into this project had their doubts, but there's something to be said.
Where do you think Spielberg would have been? Because he was afraid he was going to get fired through the whole thing. It went $5 million over budget, which was huge at that time. Hundreds of days, 100+ days over. Where do you think he would be now if he'd gotten fired? Obviously, he had Duel and he had the Twilight Zone, but that was, I think. Do you think he would? I think he would have come out of it eventually.
He probably would have come out and started directing television movies or TV in some fashion. I mean, everyone knew the man had skills.
You made an interesting point with Duel, because when you think about it, it is very, it's Jaws with a truck. It's Alien. Ridley Scott pitched Alien as Jaws in space. So, and then I think there was a million of those things that came out, not nearly as good. I mean, Alien I would put in another category, but
one of the reasons they were able to stretch the schedule ×3, I think, is because the cast wasn't expensive. And also because Lorraine Gary was part of it, and I'm sure the president of Universal, Scheinberg, was rooting for the film. And so I had heard from Zanuck that there was combative phone calls every night when they reported to the studio. To be expected. And they ran into every problem. And it sounds like he said there was a lot of threatening back and forth. I don't know how a project threatens a studio back, but that's what he said. And then ultimately, they let the movie go. They let him get it in the can. They were desperate to keep going. I think Spielberg thought every day someone was going to show up in Martha's Vineyard and terminate him on the spot and turn it over to... Incidentally, a lot has been made of a director attached to the film first, prior to Spielberg, who couldn't decipher the difference between a whale and a shark. You know the story?
I don't know.
All right, now...
That I don't.
That's the famous story that Zanuck tells about having a director attached that ultimately fell out for not knowing enough about marine biology. According to Carl Gottlieb, and you can hear him say that on Combat Radio, that director was Dick Richards, who went on to produce Tootsie, directed March or Die, Farewell My Lovely. Actually, a guy I had lunch with at his house when I was at Warner Brothers about a project, and he was like a trigger man for bonding companies. When a movie went over, they'd send him in and he'd fix it. So according to Carl Gottlieb, Dick Richards was the initial director, and Gottlieb tried to do some work on Jaws with him, and they just couldn't be in a room together after a while.
He didn't know the difference between a whale and a shark?
Well, that's the famous story. I find that hard to believe, right?
Yeah. Well, what had he done that would qualify him for directing Jaws? I mean, it was a hot property.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. That's interesting. I'll have to look into that.
But he is the famous director that they're referring to within that story, and Gottlieb, of course, pops out and names him directly, Dick Richards. Everyone else is kind of low key on the name. Somebody else, Spielberg actually said it was a different director, someone I've never heard of, but I can't back that up beyond that one audio clip of him saying that. But Gottlieb said it was Dick Richards. So here we are. Dick Richards is off the project. Spielberg is on. Lee Marvin is a pass. Sterling Hayden is a pass. Thank God. Sterling Hayden, I think, would have dated the movie.
Yes, absolutely.
And everyone else...
The Godfather, but he would have dated it. Absolutely. I mean, he looks old in The Godfather. He looks... Yeah.
It's tough now, of course, with these three monumental talents playing these three iconic roles, and think of anyone else doing it. But to actually think that it's Sterling Hayden and someone had to sell Steven on the idea of Robert Shaw because Zanuck and Brown had worked with him on The Sting, that almost seems unbelievable.
Well, that was just going to say, especially when he's coming off The Sting, which what nominated for, I think, 13 Academy Awards, won 11 or something,
Yeah.
That is shocking to me, because I know they said, they didn't want big stars, and you read over and over about how, like, the people in town didn't think much of it because excuse me, there was excitement, but nobody really knew the actors. But I'm thinking he's coming off the Sting, and I think Pelham 1, 2, 3 before that, if my timeline is right.
Well, he's brilliant in Pelham. So is Walter Matthau, and he certainly deserves his credit for that. What's funny is the casting of Murray Hamilton, who Carl Gottlieb always said would warn everyone when he reported to work that he was only good until about 3 o'clock because he liked the drink. And it's funny because all these actors give the director and the crew the same dilemma. They would say that Robert Shaw would show up, or if he had any substantial amount of downtime, he would find a bar and oftentimes rope some of the production assistants into getting drunk with him, who were like sort of tasked with the idea of keep Shaw out of the bars.
Yeah.
And of course, I don't know how you govern a guy like Shaw.
Yeah. He also hung out with the local fisherman, whose name I'm blanking on right now, but was the one that he sort of based his character on.
Ben Gardner.
Ben Gardner, who plays Ben Gardner. Yeah. Said he was the most authentic he'd ever seen at that. And he based his character on him. So I think they hung out and drank a lot as well.
Yeah.
Shaw was an unapologetic drunk. Like he absolutely cuts right to the teeth on it. There's no denial. There's no attempt to hide it. Like I said, he was known for having martinis in the makeup trailer at 4 or 5 in the morning, getting ready to start the day. Whatever. Brilliant performance. They're all... What's that?
Interesting time. Well, I'm just going to say it's an interesting time with those actors, because if you look at actors of his era, so many of them died at 45, 55, 60 if they extended out. All these great actors of that day died so young, and it was mostly, alcoholism or whatever it was that got them, but smoking, cancer. But it was just a different era for that. And, I think he would have gone on to do so many incredible things.
Absolutely. He was a super talent. He did die too young, and you can't help but respect his library of work. He was a Shakespearean guy and a pretty talented writer in his own right, so you get what you get with Shaw. But the famous Indianapolis speech, right, which is a source of contention with some people we know. Now, that's the moment where the movie really comes together, right? I think it's also the moment where the production came together and started to believe in the movie. But the Indianapolis story being a real story and being told by Quint in the galley of the Orca, which, by the way, there's that awful movie about the killer whale with Bo Derek, who's easy to watch.
Orca, right?
Orca.
Yeah.
It's such an obvious... Anyway. We'll have to break that down at another time, because I think this calls for an Orca breakdown, this show. But
maybe we could do a whole Bo Derek, show.
Yeah, we should. Something honoring Bo Derek, who's still with us.
Yes. I think that Indianapolis speech was like 10 or 8 or 10 pages long initially or something, and it was a whole bunch of people got into it, Gottlieb as well. But I think Shaw is credited mostly for paring it down. You'll know better than I on that with Gottlieb, but...
Well, there's different versions of it, right? Here's the thing. Spielberg says Sackler came up with a half page that triggered the moment. Milius is credited by Spielberg as writing the scene, and he says he wrote it over the phone. Now, I was a step and fetch it for Milius over at Warner Brothers, and that scene to me sounds like vintage Milius. I feel like I can always tell where and what he's written. In fact, I remember even talking to director Ted Kotcheff about Uncommon Valor, a film Milius produced, and I get into the whole, speech that Gene Hackman has in the movie about strapping frozen bodies to the tanks in the valley of death. And I actually asked Kotcheff, I said, that sounds like Milius. Did he write that part? And Kotcheff goes, I think he did, actually. Good ear. So I'm not saying that's a special talent, but being around Milius, you can kind of get a sense for the way his lexicon, right? So the Indianapolis speech sounds like, to me, Milius. However, Carl Gottlieb on Combat Radio, I asked him, I said, did Milius write the speech? And his response, and it's there in the archives, is fuck no, he didn't write it. Now, Spielberg credits him. Milius, who's got no reason to lie about it, his credits are through the roof. Says he wrote it, and says he wrote it over the phone. Now, supposedly in the Jaws log, Carl Gottlieb breaks down the time frame when Milius supposedly would have written this, which would have been like 2 or 4 in the morning. Now, I'm going to tell you, I know for a fact that when the movie Night Drop was discussed between Kubrick and Milius, a movie that actually I brought to... let me backtrack. While at Warner Brothers, I picked up the Marshall book Night Drop, brought it to Milius, and said, this is the movie you should direct and adapt for the screen. And he turned around and said, oh, we were already going to do it. You know who was going to direct it? Kubrick. And then he tells me a story about, I remember being on the phone with Kubrick, and Kubrick would call me at 2 a.m, and I would nod off. And then I'd wake up an hour later, and Kubrick would still be talking, pontificating on the same thought. And I'd say, wow, 2 or 3 a.m. He said, well, a lot of times directors we're working at 2 or 3 a.m. because when the lightning strikes, you're conveying your thoughts, your ideas. So it's not actually out of the realm of reality to have a conversation about the Indianapolis at 2 a.m. So the timetable to me is not evidence that he didn't write it, but Carl Gottlieb is the guy I trust in the equation, being our first-hand production insider on Jaws, and he says his answer was, fuck no, Milius didn't write it. And it's interesting. It's become sort of that Rashomon moment of cinema, right, where everyone sort of remembers it differently. Yes. But Gottlieb did credit primarily, he said, Sackler and Shaw, basically Shaw, editing down everyone's thoughts and contributions, of which I would say undoubtedly Milius must have pitched in some ideas on it at the very least, and Gottlieb's own sort of crack at it. And then Shaw basically, as the editor, gave you the Indianapolis moment over a two-day take, one drunk and one sober, and they're edited together, and you said you can't tell which is which, right?
I have I have watched that to the point of wanting to memorize it at some point, and I couldn't tell you where it separates.
All right, neither can I.
But you are absolutely right. That scene is sort of the glue where those characters really come together, and
right.
And I mean, just you can the brilliance of the acting in that is even the moment like where they keep going and Scheider, Shaw's talking and Scheider's still laughing at the joke, and you just see that melt away from him when he realizes what he doesn't even know what the story's about yet. He goes, what's that? And Hooper gets it immediately. Just everybody has their point of view there, and it is brilliantly acted. I mean, nobody better than Shaw.
Yeah, I agree with you. And then, of course, that scene is interrupted by Joe Alves kicking a panel with a garden hose.
That's awesome.
Hence the next bit of magic. It's interesting. Like, I think the movie's pretty much flawless, but there is a thought I have when Brody, the shark surprises him, and he has the famous line, which he improvised, right? Yeah. We're going to need a bigger boat. And I always sit back and watch that moment and go, now? Now you think you need a bigger boat? You needed a bigger fucking boat before you left the harbor. It's like, come on. You know what this thing has been ripping through the populace. It's like you go out on like the orca looks like something the Little Rascals put together for one of their little I mean, I'm looking at that thing going, nope.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Nope. This thing is a 25-foot great white. Of course, they discover, or they actually argue about the length, 20 versus 25 from the boat.
I was just going to ask you, because I read that initially they were thinking 30 feet. Mm-hmm. And they thought it was too long. Then they thought 20, and they thought it was too short. So that's how they sort of settled on 25 feet, which seemed like it could, realistic. Did he talk about how they came to the...
Yes. Alves told the story in one of his multiple appearances with us, where he, like on the wall of the parking structure, he did two versions of the shark, one 20 feet and one 30 feet, knowing how studios make their decision, and they were going to say something in the middle, right? Because that's usually the answer. So his target was 25 feet out of the gate, so he did that. An example of a 20-foot, a little too small, 30 feet, a little too ridiculous. I mean, they thought, up until they actually screened the movie for a test audience, that people might laugh at the shark. They were genuinely concerned about that. And of course, the problems with the shark are notorious. Bob Matty, who worked on 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, built it. And one of the great moments on Combat Radio is when Disney Imagineer Bob Gurr, who designed parts of Disneyland, like the Omnimover for the Haunted Mansion, designed the monorail, the Matterhorn, first man down the Matterhorn, in fact, when he and Joe Alves met on Combat Radio, and they had Bob Matty in common, and the conversation just went in to all things Matty and how he built the shark. And well, there's multiple sharks. There's a shark that goes left. There's a shark that goes right. There's a shark for the And that's one of the reasons Martha's Vineyard, who was really opposed to having movie companies move in and shoot. One of the reasons Martha's Vineyard was actually chosen was because it was shallow enough for the sled and clear enough, I guess. So there you have it. But if you look at the designs and the contraptions, it's brilliant. The system obviously didn't work, and they had to rebuild it with air compressors.
But that was really just because of the salt water, right? They had tested it in fresh water, but the salt water affected it differently. But I learned, which I didn't know, that it was the first movie ever actually shot on the ocean.
Yeah, well, I have heard that too, and I can't think of another one. But it's... Can you imagine actually engineering a shark, getting it to work, and then the moment it goes into the water, it fails you?
Yeah.
And thank God they had frogmen and technicians who got it to work. I mean, like I said at the top of the show, if you mention that shark didn't work in front of Joe Alves, he will argue with you. Yeah. You know, and
well enough. It worked well enough. I mean, it worked enough to be very effective. And you know, the design of it and the painting of it and all that stuff when it comes on that boat and stuff. I mean, you believe it's a 25-foot shark.
Yeah, you don't doubt it for a second. Butler, the DP, actually sank one of the orcas when he attached like a metal rod so a speedboat could kind of pull it like it looked like a shark punched it, and he pulled the paneling out of the hull, and the whole thing goes. And then Zanuck, of course, says, well, I'm the guy that's got to call Sid Sheinberg at Universal and say the boat sank. And, and keep in mind, he's got to make that call amidst of daily phone calls reporting disasters. Like, he's got to actually go, Sid, how are you? I'm glad your golf game's good. Look, I don't know how to tell you this. The orca's lost. Or I know they had a couple of different ones, but the orca's done. We got to figure. I mean, it's like, you know.
What do you know about the universe? Because I read that, I had heard that the actual orca was at Universal Studios for a long time, and then it got dismantled, and Steven Spielberg got furious about that. That it was actually torn apart or destroyed or something.
I've heard different stories regarding the orca boats, and it's been a while since I've actually looked at the facts of that part of this case. I know that there's a Martha Vineyards-based fisherman who says he can actually point to one of the orcas on the beach, and there's still some of it left today. That's the one that sank. It washed up there, and it stayed there, and it's still there. Now, I've heard other people say that boat was actually taken and refabbed. And then I've heard other people say what you just said, which is, no, the actual orca is at Universal. And then I've heard other people at Universal, where we're based, I mean, there's got to be someone we can ask, who said, no, that's always been a dummy boat.
Oh, see, I read that it for a while they had the real one at Universal on the tour, and then for whatever reason they thought it was rotting or whatever, and they destroyed it, and nobody ever went to Spielberg about it and asked, and he got furious.
I've heard that story. Yeah. I've heard that story, and it actually, I mean, now in this day and age, that sounds very believable. But you got to remember, right? 73, 74, no one saved these things. No one thought, oh, we I mean, sometimes they'd get put in a warehouse like in Santa Ana. But not often. And they'd only get put in the warehouse because maybe the TV production or a Night Gallery episode needed it. Or we have an episode of Columbo where someone gets killed and we're going to paint the thing yellow. You know, so hang on to it. But it wasn't saved for, you know, fan purposes. And now it's like, that's hard to believe, but that's absolutely the case. These guys did not think to archive a lot of this stuff. And also keep in mind, the big movie for Universal that year was supposed to be the Hindenburg,
which is a movie I also love.
Yeah, everyone thought Jaws was going to be basically a B picture. So I don't think anyone was working on it going, save the shark, save the boat. We're going into the Hall of Fame, baby.
Yeah. It's also very interesting that they, you know, that mindset was, and I get it, but even, you know, you can go back famously to like even the original Tonight Show episodes, like few of those exist, even the early with Johnny Carson, because they would just erase over them and tape over them. They would just reuse the tapes. So when you think about, you know, I think it's only a fairly recent thing of this collector mentality. I collect movie posters. I have thousands of original movie posters. And up until the 70s, it was literally a thing, where you must destroy these before you, and people didn't. They held on to them, a lot of them. That's why you can still find them. But, poster collecting became so huge because so few of these things existed.
Well, Alves told me he actually found one of the sharks hanging outside of a junkyard in Sylmar. And for a radio broadcast for NPR, he identified it. I think he may have even identified it with Bob Matty or someone from the film, Roy Arbogast, one of the techs.
And from what I've heard about that famously, that many people offered to buy it, lots of money, and that whoever owned it would not sell it at all. And now I think it's what they're basing Greg Nicotero, Walking Dead, and all that is doing a major restoration for the movie, Lucas's movie museum, Hall of Fame museum, and I think they are doing a full restoration on it.
Well, Milius always said that Lucas broke the shark in a North Hollywood warehouse where they went to go. I don't know what it was doing. Well, I guess they were probably. I don't know why it wasn't at the studio. I don't know why the shark was being built somewhere in North Hollywood, but I guess it makes sense. And they go there and they start screwing around with it and testing it out and bust it and then run like school kids. I don't know how much of that story is, refashioned for, the comic book elements here, or if the whole thing happened as they say. But I find it hard to believe they have to break into a warehouse and fool around with the shark while their friend is on the production. I'm pretty sure he could walk them into the warehouse and say, "Look, this is it. This is how it works." And then of course, busting it. As a responsible filmmaker, you wouldn't run. You'd get the production designer on the phone and say, "Hey, look, we were looking at the shark. Something misfired and it's broken." You would report it immediately so they could fix it immediately. That's my thinking anyway. But I guess according to their story, they flee the scene and leave a broken shark for someone to put together later.
I do love, there's a book that I have that a photographer back during the day that was doing photos during the filming put together this great book, Matt Weber, I want to say his name is. And I have that book and it's thick. It's a big coffee table book. And some of the behind the scenes stuff is awesome. I think the mark, the prize for somebody working on the film had to have been them taking a picture of themselves in the mouth of the shark, because there are dozens and dozens and dozens of those. And I don't know, just to be around back in that day. And again, I don't think anybody really knew what they had, but if you just, looked at the performances and looked at whatever, and I don't even think they got dailies for a while. Like, I think those didn't start coming until they were sending piecemeal stuff out. But Verna Fields, as I read, would get stuff in and she would report back to Spielberg and say, "Okay, now we need I've got this now I need a left to right shot, or I need this," and call him dictating the shots I needed based on the pieces of footage she was getting in.
Well, it makes sense. She was so skilled at what she did. I have no doubt she advised him on some things that were probably needed. I mean, with all his talent, and that's indisputable, he had some super, super talented department heads around him. Alves, of course, is the production designer, and Gottlieb, who we've covered, but also Butler, the DP. And, those guys, I think, really stayed dedicated and pieced it together. And that's where you get the benefit of having a production team that's going to see something through. And they don't underscore what they're working on. This movie may have been disrespected by the executives at Universal out of the gate. It may have been all about the Hindenburg, but for them, they were going to make the best movie possible from day to day to day to day. And they did it. Ultimately, they delivered something that, quite frankly, ask people what they've seen, Hindenburg or Jaws, and it's no contest.
Yeah. And I always appreciate, because when I'm doing a project, I always say, I don't care if it's a commercial or a film, I approach it the exact same way. I want the quality to be as good as it can be. Right. Nobody, the old saying, nobody sets out to make a good, a bad film. And I don't think you can stress enough the importance of John Williams to the success of this project. That score on everything. If you look at John Williams' career and the movies he's done, it's like the impact that he's had on all these films, probably maybe none more than Jaws, I think.
Oh, absolutely. He's the guy that frosted the cake. It was absolutely a brilliant job, and they talk as much in between screenings where there wasn't any music and then there was his music, and the difference in the reaction. You know, another guy who later in the marketing played a key role to this, in my mind anyway, was Percy Rodriguez, who voiced the "It's been there for millions of years."
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
Jaws. You know, and he's since passed away, but he was kind of the go-to guy for Amityville Horror or movies like that, where just a brilliant guy for your
trailer. I was actually going to bring that up because I just, that trailer is fantastic. I don't know if there had been there had, but I don't know if there had been one that it was impactful as that, an eating machine, that just the way he did that trailer was awesome. Yeah.
Right. There's absolutely the way he pauses where he goes, "It has a name, terror," or something. It has a name, and it is Jaws.
God created the devil and gave him jaws.
It's like it waits like just long enough for you to be on the edge of your seat and be like, "What the?" And what's interesting in the trailer is Roy Scheider, probably because of his role in French Connections, got top billing. So there you have it. But one of my favorite stories or combat stories from the production is when the Australian unit tried to get some actual shark footage, and they used the stunt person, who happens to be a little person, into the cage. He has a heart attack because a great white tries to rip the cage apart with him in it. But he also has a miniature scaled down air tank, and they didn't compute that there was only 8 minutes of oxygen in it. So the guy almost got killed. And then ultimately it rewrote the script because the great white gets tangled on the shark cage, rips it apart. That footage is in the movie, but the cage was empty at that time. And so somebody circled back and said, "We want to use it." So guess what? Hooper, who was supposed to be killed, now lives. Get a shot of him swimming away.
Yeah. Hooper died in the book. What's your memory of? I have one very distinct memory of seeing it in the theater. What is your memory of watching it for the first time in the theater?
I didn't see it in the theater. I was too young, so I saw it quite a ways after. But I will tell you, the first thing that struck me was, not only is it a scene-to-scene riveting movie, I mean, I don't know who is the individual with the strength to put Jaws on and walk out at some point in the movie. I can't do it. I mean, I have to, even though I've seen it 100 times, get to the next point. But I remember being like completely fascinated when they're in the lagoon, or the shark rips apart Grossman, the stuntman, who's in the little sabot. Yep. And he's like, "Hey, what you kids doing there?" And he gets capsized, which also, by the way, there was a much more gruesome version of that death that was shot that they ultimately didn't use. He gets capsized and, his leg gets separated and drops to the ocean floor. I remember watching that, and you can see the shark get him under the water and going, even as a kid, going, "How do you suppose they got that shot?" And obviously now we know, but as a young man, I'm like, that's amazing that they thought to actually show you the shark under the water get this guy. I mean, that was the most horrific scene in the movie for me. And I just remember being blown away by that element. What about you?
So I worked in movie theaters all through high school.
Uh-oh.
And so we'd work at, do the thing, and then you'd get to go to the movies. So the day it opened, I didn't have to wait, and all the lines were crazy. It was at St. Vincent Mall in Shreveport, Louisiana, and the AMC theater, and the line was all the way down the mall, and people just clamoring to get into this thing. And so we hadn't got to see it yet, but you could go after your shift was over and go to a screening and watch it. So I didn't have to wait in all the lines and everything. But I remember sitting in there, and it is one of my most vivid memories from any movie, is sitting in watching it, and that head pops out of the boat. Gardner's head pops out of the boat, and it's the first and only time I've ever been in a movie where I literally got rained on with popcorn. Everybody in that theater flipped up their popcorn, and it was just like raining down popcorn everywhere. It's one of my most vivid memories from any movie because it was such a scare, and then you learn later it was like done in a pool with, and
yeah. Once they pull back the curtain on where and how they got that shot, basically in the San Fernando Valley, but that only makes it more fascinating that they're willing to, or they're able to engage an audience. I mean, at that point, there's also been arguments between Benchley and Spielberg, or rumored to have been disagreements about the ending, where the shark is basically drowned.
Right.
And Spielberg said, no, 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 I need something, I need a bang here. And he was absolutely right, which Benchley concedes. But it brings up the mentality of once the audience is on the roller coaster, you know, it's pretty much going to go full throttle. You can do very little to screw it up once you set the stage and it's going and it's moving. And that by the time you see that head pop out, you're already so invested in this movie.
No, you are. I think too, the power of that movie is the impact it's had. You know, there's obviously famously the cliche of people still won't go in the water. They did a research study, used Jaws and The Exorcist to study the effects of stress on people who are so stressed out by, you know, certain things. But to me, it's like, even I believe I'm right in this, that even Benchley in later years has gone, no, sharks are not that bad. You know, it's like there was such it created such a negative thing that, you know, people had to actually come out and say, you know what, it's a movie, you know, they're really not that bad. It was a book. So I think the impact, and not only, you know, the first summer blockbuster, I think Star Wars was the only one that it knocked off The Godfather, you know, the other movie we've talked about that's my all-time favorite, and then Star Wars ended up knocking it off in terms of gross. But just the impact that I think it had for everything, and I don't know if all of it's, you know, positive. It did, as a movie, it's unparalleled, I think, but unparalleled. But, you know, it did become a thing where every film after that had to make $100 million, and, you know, and stuff like that. So I think it created, you know, some other things that have affected the industry since. And it would have come one way or the other. It would have come from Star Wars, if not Jaws. But well, man, it's just.
Prior to the pandemic, I would take the golf cart down, leave our studio, and shoot down to where the Jaws animatronic was scaring the tram, if you could call it that. And I'd watch basically the nostalgia people had for the film as this thing popped out. And, oh, look, it's Jaws. And you'd watch everyone shooting photos of this thing that's dated and, you know, ricketing almost like a Chuck E. Cheese. But it's great. It's great. And I think it's great because it takes us back to the movie. When I was at Warner Brothers, everyone would make the argument, well, that I recalled and that I spoke to, that The Godfather was the best movie ever made. And I agree with that. But I would make an argument for this, too. I think Jaws, in its way, unbelievable movie.
Yeah. The thing that on the tour, when the shark comes out, that would even still sell a bit. You're right about the rickety and all that. If you didn't see the as it backs back into the water, you know.
Yeah. It's funny because that doubles as Cabot Cove, or did double as Cabot Cove for Murder, She Wrote for a decade and a half.
Yeah.
You know, she was solving crimes at Amity.
Yep. I've been to Martha's Vineyard there where they shot it, because I went to school in Boston and I lived on the East Coast for a long time, and it was a pilgrimage to me. I mean, it was just like to go there where they shot that, and, you know, and of course every tourist shop, you know, probably to this day still is, you know, everything is Jaws themed and whatever.
Right.
Yeah, but deservedly so. I just think it's just such a. I don't know. There are movies you look at, and probably several of them with Shaw, you know, The Sting, I think, is one, The Godfather, where like just about every element is perfect, you know.
And even where fate worked its way into the script, it works well. I mean, I have no problems with Hooper surviving. You know, Quint is a character driven by vengeance. I can't see Sterling Hayden playing the part, and Shaw literally gets bitten in half. You know, that's not the way he dies in the book either. He gets like ripped off the bow, gets tangled up in a rope or something, and yeah. And the shark takes him. It's like basically the Captain Ahab ending. A similar death to Gregory Peck and, you know, the Millville classic. So it all seems to work. I mean, the movie itself, I can't, when I think of it, think of a weak point that I don't buy into, except for my own paranoia as a shark hunter, or an amateur shark hunter, saying, we're not going in that. We've got the Coast Guard for this shit. We're going to get them out here. They've got the automatic weapons, the explosives. You know, we're not going to get. And I love that line where, well, first I love when Brody arrives at the dock. His wife says, that must be Quint. He scares me. And he immediately goes into a conversation that most real parents would have, which is, hey, don't use the fireplace in the den because I haven't fixed the flue yet. He gets into all the concerning parental things, and she's like, what am I going to tell the kids? Like, that is so real to me.
Yeah.
And then the whole, Hooper with his technology and Quint being like, what are you, some kind of half-ass astronaut? And I buy into all of it. It is so well done, I think.
And I've done I've done a lot of stuff for National Geographic and travel, and I've done several shark dives. Most famously, for me, off the coast of Bora Bora, and we non-caged with probably 40 sharks swimming around us, and that was a case where the boat ended up leaving me for a bit, it is, that movie always comes to your mind. You can be 125 feet under the water, and I remember the first time that a shark swam by me, and I'm like, just sucking up oxygen, and that's what goes through your mind.
No, look, with all due respect to shark divers, and I get it. To me, that's the equivalent of running through a minefield or running through a burning building. Like, why do you want to? Why do you want to just tempt the fate of?
Yeah,
No.
I feel that way about bungee jumping. I've skydived a couple of times, but I don't really have the need to do it many more times. Bungee jumping, I have.
There's moments where I just want to put a hand up and be like, look, life is actually exciting enough. I don't need to play some sort of form of roulette with my. We don't need to put a round in the chamber and hope it doesn't go off. Have fun. My wife is like a certified diver, and every time she tells stories, I'm like, forget it. I'll stick with surfing. I'll stay on the surface, and we'll call it even.
I've said this on shows with you before, but I always say that I always look back on a lot of the things that I've done in the field with a lot more fondness than you do when you're in the middle of it.
Of course.
At the time, it's like your job. That's my job. I've got to get the shot. I'm doing it. I've dived with piranhas. I've been shot at in different locations, under military takeovers and stuff like that. You just sort of do it in the moment, but then you look back and go, that was kind of stupid, but the shark dives were cool, but scary in their own right. But Jaws always comes in your mind.
One of the things I respect is Spielberg retelling of the what is essentially his production Vietnam, with so much honesty, being honest about his insecurity, being honest about his sense of dread. I mean, he rose to the challenge. Of that, there is no, you cannot deny that. But yeah, right. But I mean, he's very open about what his personal challenges were in a way that I think is actually refreshing. Because you talk to a lot of directors and they kind of come off as elitists who always had the right idea, and there's sort of a retelling or a reimagining of the way the battle went down. But he's pretty open about, like, look, I was 27 or whatever, however old, and I didn't know which end was up, and I had these personalities to govern. But again, fortunately, he had people rooting for him, Scheinberg, one of them, including a crew that was determined.
At that time, certainly.
Right. And the crew was determined to get it done. And, as we said at the top of the show, the production challenges are obviously well known. I mean, it's a blueprint in film schools everywhere as to what you might face.
He actually warned when Costner and Kevin Reynolds came to them to talk about Waterworld. He actually said, do not do a film on the ocean. It will cause you nothing but problems.
And it did in that case.
Yeah.
I mean, Waterworld, well, let's not, dude, we can't dare to even.
Really good ride. It's a really good stunt show.
Yeah. Again, like during our lunch breaks, when we break from the studio, you can walk up and see the Waterworld show. And it's funny because kids today, a lot of them haven't seen the movie. So they're like, what is this? And I'm like, well, this goes to a movie that's one of Hollywood's great disasters. And enjoy it. Basically, enjoy it. Well, that brings... Final thoughts on Jaws, Jude?
Oh man, I just think, you said it earlier, but it's a film that can be on TV. It's a film that can pop up anywhere. It's a film that somebody can start talking about, and I'm just all in. It's just, I think it is, I am a lover of practical effects, and
Me too.
CG has its place and they do some great things with it, but I am a lover of practical effects, and through, like you said, fate and whatever issues they had and whatever, I don't think that would have worked in today's thing with CGI shark. I mean, they've tried it with a couple of movies and it's just not as impactful. And I just think that movie beginning to end is a testament to Spielberg and everybody who worked on that as just one of the, I think it will stand the test of time for as long as people are talking about movies.
Yeah, and the film is sort of code for ignorant political moves and ignorant politicians everywhere. And we see a lot of that today. It's like, we know there's a shark out there and we know it's already killed someone, but why, Harry, why are you not in the water?
Yeah.
It's like, well, I just thought I'd be getting some of this sun. And he's like, at that moment too, I'd be like, hey, this is a town of maybe 3,600 people, Mayor. Why don't you go fuck yourself? You get in the water. And that's what's amazing, that the guy takes his family out into the water, which, by the way, I've never seen an ocean so flat in my life as in that scene. It looks like they're shooting on Lake Superior. But as soon as the mayor goes, why aren't you in the water? I'd be like, why the fuck aren't you in the water, Mr. Mayor? I'm like, you got to be kidding me with this. Why am I not in the water? Typical politician, right? Yeah. It's like, I'm enjoying some of this sun. There's that, just great moments. Oh, the movie's just full of so much. Obviously, you can't go 4th of July without seeing Jaws. It's too epic and too amazing. And there's other mysterious parallels that we can get into another time. There's a rumor that one of the extras on it was actually killed in Nantucket. But that's a subject for another day. Yeah.
You'll have to tell me that.
Yeah, and I don't know if she was killed during production. I think they think it was a he, right? Or shortly after. But there's a whole sort of online case study about what happened to the extra in Jaws. Anyway, that's the fun fact for next episode. With Jude, the man who once interviewed Charles Manson, and myself, I want to say thank you for joining us. The movie's been Jaws.
Jaws.